Last week, then, we began this study of the book of Job, and we began by introducing the book and looking at some of the background details to the book and some of the things that we don't know about the book. There's quite a bit that we don't know about who wrote it or where it was set or when it was written. But it is an important book, and it's perhaps one which is a bit difficult for us to understand. We go there expecting to find answers to the problem of suffering, but perhaps the answers that we're seeking are not to be found there. It's a book that is more about God than Job, and tells us more of the character of God and how God deals with us in our situations in life. So we're going to go into the text this evening. This was the outline we put up last week of the whole book here. So we begin with the prologue, which forms the first two chapters and the testing of Job, and then we go into the main section of the book, which is this cycle of speeches between Job and his three friends. There's an interlude in chapter 28, and then Job and Elihu, and a fourth friend who turns up on the scene in chapter 29. And his speeches, and then finally the final section is when the Lord himself appears out of the whirlwind and speaks to Job in those final chapters, and then it concludes with an epilogue at the end where things are put back for Job there. So this is a more detailed outline of the prologue, the first two chapters, and this evening we'll be looking at the first two scenes here from this prologue. The prologue concerns the testing of Job, and it's divided up into these different scenes. So the first scene will be Job and his family in chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, and then scene 2, it takes place in the presence of the Lord in verses 6 to 12. So we'll begin here reading Job chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, which says, "There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. That man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very large household. That man was wealthier than anyone in the East. It was the custom of his sons to hold feasts, each on his set day in his own home. They would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a round of feast days was over, Job would send word to them to sanctify themselves, and rising early in the morning, he would make burnt offerings, one for each of them. But Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts." This is what Job always used to do. The book of Job begins with this prologue in the first 2 chapters, and it ends with the prologue. It ends with an epilogue in chapter 42, and these are the 2 prose narratives which set the scene here at the beginning, and they provide the conclusion at the end of the story. And then in between, in the main body of the book, are this poetic section, this poetic exchange of these speeches between Job and his friends and between Job and God. So the prologue here presents scenes which alternate between what's happening on earth and then what is happening in the presence of the Lord. So in the first scene, then, we have, which is just read in verses 1 to 5, is Job and his family. And the book opens with an introduction to Job. There was a man in the land of Uz named Job. As we mentioned last week, the location of Uz is uncertain. It may be in the territory of Edom, which is down to the southeast of the Dead Sea. You can probably see that marked on the map on the slide there. And there's a couple of references which associate us with Edom in Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 20. which is listing the various nations that are going to experience the wrath of God. Verse 19 mentions Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and then verse 20 says, and all the foreign folk among them, and then all the kings of the land of Uz, and all the kings of the land of the Philistines. So just in the middle of verse 20 there, we have the kings of the land of Uz who are mentioned, and these other surrounding nations associated or closely associated with that region. And then in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 21, which I think we read last week as well, Lamentations chapter 4, verse 21, which says, rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, dweller in the land of Uz. So again, the association between Edom, the land of Edom, and the land of Uz there. So possibly Uz is in that region southeast of the Dead Sea in Edom. Other suggestions are made as well, perhaps further north in the area of Aram or Syria. Uz was also the name of the firstborn son of Abraham's brother Nahor, mentioned in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 21. And sometimes the name of a person would become associated with the land in which they lived as well. So Genesis chapter 22, verse 21 mentions, a message came to Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. And verse 21 says, Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother. So Uz was the firstborn of Abraham's brother Nahor. And then the name Uz is also found in Genesis chapter 36 and verse 28 in the genealogy there of the Edomites. Genesis 36 verse 28. The chapter begins with the descendants of Esau who went and lived in the land of Edom, what became the land of Edom. And then verse 28 there in those lists of names mentions the sons of Dishan, Uz is named there. So again, we see the occurrence of this name Uz in these other places as well, but we can't really be sure of where the land of Uz is, where Job is said to dwell. The name Job itself is a translation of the Hebrew Iyov, the meaning again of which is uncertain. One suggestion is that it's derived from an earlier form of the name, meaning where is the father? Again, we don't really know, but the name is also found in some Canaanite texts which date from around 2000 BC. So it is a name that is found in these other texts or inscriptions as well. Job's character is summarized for us here in verse 1. The writer says, that man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. The description of Job here does not mean that he was sinless or perfect, but rather that he was a man of integrity, a man of good moral character, someone who revered God. Abraham is also described in a similar way as having feared God in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 12, after the incident with the offering of Isaac, and God had asked him to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice. Genesis chapter 22 verse 12 says, he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And this attitude of fearing God isn't talking about being terrorized by God or being afraid of God, but rather having that reverential respect for God, holding God in awe. And this is the characteristic of the person who is approved of. Particularly, we find this expression in the wisdom literature of the Bible. And as we mentioned last week, Job, the book of Job fits into that category of wisdom literature. So in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7 mentions the fear of God here associated with wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then Proverbs chapter 3 verse 7 says, "Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and turn away from evil." Many other references as well in the book of Proverbs to this idea of fearing God, that is the wise thing to do. And in Ecclesiastes, again, Ecclesiastes is another book that is categorized as wisdom literature. Right at the end there, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, the writer says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." So Job then is described here as one who feared God and one who shunned evil. Concerning his family, we're told here that Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The numbers 7 and 3 and their sum of 10 are symbolic numbers, symbolic of completeness. So perhaps the numbers here are intended for us to see this as the perfect family. His wealth is assessed in terms of his livestock. In verse 3, we're told that he had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses. And again, they're round numbers. And again, the numbers here may suggest the idea of completeness. And also, in addition, he had a very large household, or very many servants, as the Revised Standard Version puts it. And the writer says of him in verse 3, "That man," as Job, "was wealthier than anyone in the East." Or Revised Standard Version again has, "the greatest of all the people of the East." For the Israelites who were living west of the River Jordan, the East, that term the East, covered a wide expanse of territory, including Edom, Moab and Ammon, and Syria. So it's a wide area of territory, and Job has this reputation as being one of the wealthiest man, one of the wealthiest men in that region. It was also a region that was noted for its wisdom. So we see in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 and 30. 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 29 says that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and largeness of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. So this general area known as the East was renowned for people of wisdom being there. And the description of Job's wealth that we have here in terms of his livestock is similar to that which is given of Isaac in Genesis chapter 26, verses 12 to 14. Which says that Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. So similar description there of Isaac as we have of Job here. So the material prosperity that Job had and this big family as enjoyed by Job would have been understood by the Hebrews as a sign of God's blessing and God's approval. God must be pleased with Job. God must be blessing him because he has this great wealth and he has this big family. Job's concern that his family should behave appropriately is illustrated here in verses 4 to 6. Job's sons have a custom of holding a feast in their homes on their set day, which possibly is a reference to their birthdays or to some other regular occasion, and their sisters are invited along to eat and drink with them. And then when the round of feasts is over, Job would send word to his children to sanctify themselves. And whilst Job himself would get up early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for each of his children as a precaution in case they had sinned in thought during their time of feasting. So as head of the family, then Job is acting in a priestly role in making these offerings, as the patriarchs did. And we see examples of that, of Noah doing that in Genesis chapter 8, Abraham doing it in Genesis chapter 12, Isaac doing it in Genesis chapter 26, that the patriarch, the head of the family, had this role of setting up an altar and making these offerings. And so this is what Job is doing here. And he reasoned in verse 5, perhaps my children have sinned and blasphemed God in their thoughts. So this is a precautionary action that Job is taking here, just in case his children have sinned. He seems that he doesn't think his children would sin or blaspheme God openly, but perhaps in their thoughts, that they'd had some bad thoughts about God. And this was a routine that Job did. Thus Job did continually. So this was his habit of how he would behave. So the book opens then with this picture of Job, a sort of ideal picture. He's a good man who seeks to live an upright, godly life. He's above reproach. He rejects evil. He is a prosperous man of great wealth. He's a family man who's concerned about the spiritual well-being of his children. We don't know for sure where he lived, where this land of Uz is, but somewhere east of the Jordan, outside of Israel. We don't know if he was an Israelite. Again, that would depend on when the book is set, the historical setting of the book, but he's a believer in God, the God who's worshipped by Abraham, worshipped by Israel. And it is this righteous character of Job that really forms an essential feature of the book. Why is Job like this? Why is Job righteous? And how will Job respond when his righteousness is put to the test, and when it's questioned, and when things get turned upside down? So we move on then to scene 2 here in this prologue, and the action shifts now. So we'll read here verses 6 to 12. One day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord, and the adversary came along with them. The Lord said to the adversary, "Where have you been?" The adversary answered the Lord, "I have been roaming all over the earth." The Lord said to the adversary, "Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil." The adversary answered the Lord, "Does Job not have good reason to fear God? Why, it is you who have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face." The Lord replied to the adversary, "See, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on him." The adversary departed from the presence of the Lord. So the scene now changes from what we've been told of Job's life on earth to events that are taking place in the presence of the Lord. We're not told heaven, the word heaven isn't used there, but it's presumably heaven because it's in the presence of the Lord. And the picture here is that of a royal court or a council where the Lord receives those who serve him in order to hear an account of their activities and perhaps to give them their assignments. And we have similar picture of a court or a royal council in some other verses as well. In Psalm 82 and verse 1, which says, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment." And then verse 6 of that psalm, he says, "I say, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you." So he's addressing those who are in that divine council there. And then Psalm 89, verse 5 Let the heavens praise thy wonders, O Lord, thy faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. So there's reference there to the assembly of the holy ones. And then verse 7, a God feared in the council of the holy ones, great and terrible above all that are round about him. So this idea of this council, God being holding this council where these holy ones or sons of God are assembled as well. And then another passage in 1 Kings chapter 22, which in some ways are quite similar to what we have going on in Job here. 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 to 23. This is the story of the two kings, King Ahab of Israel, King Jehoshaphat of Judah, and their Ahab wants them both to go out to do battle with the Syrians. Ahab calls on his false prophets to advise him, and they all encourage him to go. Jehoshaphat is more godly. He wants a second opinion, and they call in this man Micaiah, who's a prophet of the Lord, for his view on this. And verse 19 says, and Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go forth and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go forth and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has spoken evil concerning you. Again, we see something similar going on there, that there's this assembly with the Lord and those spirits who are present, and one is being sent out to be this lying spirit in the mouths of Ahab's false prophets. So we have this picture of the sort of assembly or council that is going on behind the scenes, things that are happening behind the scenes and have an influence upon events that happen on earth. So we who are the readers of the book of Job, we are being privileged in a way to be given this glimpse of these proceedings, and in that we're provided with an explanation of how Job came to suffer as he does. But Job and his friends with him don't know any of this. They're unaware of this, completely unaware of what's going on in the presence of the Lord. So verse 6 here says, one day the divine beings presented themselves before the Lord. The phrase, the divine beings there, literally it would be translated as sons of God, which is how several versions translate that: Revised Standard Version, English Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, and the Authorized Version. So sons of God are these divine beings. It's translated as angels in the New International Version, and in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's translated there as the angels of God, if we translated it into English. So these are heavenly beings, and they present themselves before the Lord on a particular day. The Lord here, the name there is Yahweh, which is the personal name of God used in his covenant with Israel. So that's the name of God that is being used here, Lord or Yahweh. And amongst those who present themselves before the Lord was one who is commonly identified as Satan. And he has access to God the same as the others. He's not a gate crasher. He has access. The Revised Standard Version translates this as, and Satan also came among them. And a number of other versions translate this as Satan as well. And in these versions, Satan is capitalized, capital S, and used as a proper name. However, the Hebrew text reads Ha-Satan, which translates as the Satan. So Satan should not be rendered as a personal name, because in Hebrew, personal names are not preceded by the definite article, the. You don't say the Job or the Abraham or the Sarah. So the word Satan means adversary, opponent, or obstructor, or challenger. The New Jewish Publication Society Bible, which I've been reading from, translates this as, and the adversary came along with them. The word Satan describes what a person does, so it's a verb, and it's also a noun, so what a person does or what a person is. It may surprise you to find that the first Satan who's mentioned in the Bible is not a serpent in the Garden of Eden, but is the angel of the Lord. In Numbers chapter 22 and verse 22, the word Satan is used of the angel of the Lord, who is opposing the prophet Balaam's disobedience. This is the story of Balaam, who had been sent for by the king of Moab, Balak, who wanted Balaam to come and curse the Israelites who were coming into his land. And at first, Balaam says he won't go and do it. And then he has a change of mind, and he goes off. The Lord tells him to go the second time. Verse 21 of Numbers chapter 22 says, so Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his ass and went with the princes of Moab. But God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. And adversary there is Satan. The angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his Satan. Verse 32 as well uses the word as well. This is after the ass has spoken to Balaam, and the angel of Balaam ends up seeing the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord speaks to him. The angel of the Lord said to him, why have you struck your ass these 3 times? Behold, I have come forth to withstand you. And withstand is the word there for adversary or Satan, to withstand you because your way is perverse before me. So the angel of the Lord, this is the first time the word Satan is used. The angel of the Lord is a Satan here, in that he is opposing Balaam. The word Satan is also used of those who are human enemies or opponents, and a number of examples here. 1 Samuel chapter 29 and verse 4. This is when David is with the Philistines, and the Philistines are going out to fight against King Saul. David is with them. David says he's going to go along with them, but the Philistines, some of the Philistines don't want him to go. So 1 Samuel 29 verse 4 says, but the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. They're angry with Achish, who's one who's promoting David to go. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the man back, that's referring to David, send the man back that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? So they think that David, if he fought in the battle with them, he would turn against them, he would become an adversary. And that word adversary there is the word Satan. He would become a Satan to them. 2 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 22, another example here. This is David again, concerns David, and his dispute with the son Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who wanted David to kill this man Shimei because Shimei had insulted David earlier. But David said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? So he speaks of them as being an adversary to him, again, as a Satan to him. Well, there's a few other examples here as well. Let's have a look at another. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 14. In the time of Solomon here, the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. So again, an enemy who's raised up against Solomon, an adversary, a Satan. Verse 23, another one here, God also raised up an adversary to him, Rezin, the son of Eliada. Other examples in the Psalms as well. We won't look at all of the references here, but we see how this word Satan is used of these human enemies, these human adversaries, opponents. And then it's used in Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, which is perhaps a bit closer to our example in Job, our Satan in Job. Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1 says, Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord has chosen Jerusalem. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire? So here in the Revised Standard, it's capitalized again as a capital, as if it's the name, but it's not. It's just saying a Satan, an adversary. But in this case, it's referring to a spiritual being who, and Zechariah is seeing this in the form of a vision. He sees Joshua standing before the Lord, and Satan, this adversary, standing at his side to accuse him. And then in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1, another example of this use here, where again it could be a human adversary or it could be a spiritual being. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1, which says Satan, again it's capitalized here indicating a name, but again we have to be careful about that. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So again, it's an adversary who stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So in the Old Testament, then there's no single spiritual being who is named Satan, but there are lots of Satans. There are human Satans, and there are spiritual beings, as in Job and in Zechariah, who are in that role of playing an adversary or an opponent of some kind. The use of Satan as a proper name doesn't occur really until around the 2nd century BC. So in Old Testament times, people wouldn't recognize Satan as the name of a particular being. It's only when we come into the New Testament that Satan is used as this proper name of the being who we think of today as Satan or the devil, the one who opposes and accuses God and Christ and his people. And a number of references to Satan that we have in the New Testament, that it was Satan who tempted Jesus. Satan is described as disguising himself as an angel of light. In the book of Revelation, John uses the term as well. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9. Uh, This is the vision that John is recording here. He says, war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And then also Revelation chapter 20 and verse 2. Which says, speaks of the angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, that he should deceive the nations no more. So in the New Testament, he's this deceiving character. Jesus referred to him as being a liar and the father of lies. So it's when we get into the New Testament that we have more of the development of the character of the person who is Satan. But in the Old Testament, we don't have that. In this case, in the book of Job, the adversary or the Satan is unnamed, but his role is that of opposing and challenging Job and God. He's like the prosecution counsel for the prosecution. To identify him as Satan that we read of in the New Testament is really reading back into Job those things that we learn from those later texts about him. Doesn't mean that it's not the same, but we have to be careful about doing that kind of thing. So when the adversary appears before the Lord questions him. Where have you been? He asks. The question is not asked because the Lord does not know where he's been, but as a way of opening a conversation. And the adversary replies, I have been roaming all over the earth. Or Revised Standard Version has from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. His purpose in roaming over the earth is not stated here, but it seems that he's observing people, what people are doing, and he knows Job, he's familiar with Job. So the Lord then says to the adversary, have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. The Lord's praise of Job then repeats what we were told of him in verse 1 of the chapter. The Lord is simply repeating those characteristics of Job that we were told at the beginning. In addition, though, the Lord refers to Job here as my servant. So those whom God approves of, who are loyal to him, often referred to as his servants. It's an honourable title. And there's no one on earth like Job. He's this exemplary character. The Lord's expression of approval of Job then provokes the adversary into challenging the way that God has treated Job. So the adversary now suggests that Job has good reason to fear God, because he says, you have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out in the land. What he's saying here is that God has protected Job and his household, put this shield, this fence around him, and blessed him with many possessions. So this is the reason why Job fears God, why he is of blameless and upright character. So the suggestion is, well, no one would be this good for nothing without being rewarded by God in some way. So the adversary is arguing that people only serve God for what they can get out of it. If there's no reward for living a righteous life, and if wrongdoing is not punished, would they still do that which is right? Would they still live that upright life? So the adversary thinks that God operates on this principle that righteous behavior is always rewarded and wrongdoing is always punished. And people will serve God not because of who he is, but because it will be beneficial to them. It will be to their advantage that they serve him. We might put the question to ourselves today, well, if there was no promise of heaven, would you still become a Christian? If there was no threat of going to hell, would you still become a Christian? So to test this out, then, the adversary proposes this challenge. He says, but lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. So if the Lord inflicts some harm upon Job, then Job will turn against God and he will curse God. Curse God to his face. So the Lord takes him up on this. He accepts the challenge. In verse 12, he replies to the adversary, see, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on him. The Lord then will allow the adversary to do whatever he wishes to Job's possessions and Job's family. And the one restriction is that he is not to lay his hand on Job himself, so not to inflict any kind of physical punishment or pain upon Job himself. The adversary can only do then what God permits him to do. He doesn't have the power, he doesn't have the authority to act on his own or to act independently. So God allows this to happen in the confident expectation of proving the adversary wrong, that people do not behave righteously just for what they can get out of it or just in order to avoid punishment. So Job then is to become this sort of test case to test out how God works, how God operates, and how people respond to that. And the Lord here is confident of how Job will respond to that. And so we're told there in verse 12 that the adversary then left the presence of the Lord. So he goes away and he goes to implement this plan to provide this test of Job, to see how Job will respond when these certain things happen to him. Is he still going to remain righteous and upright, or is he going to turn against God when it affects him in that way? And that's where we'll pick up next week and see what happens as the story develops here. But we will stop here